Hello, and welcome to another video in our series regarding relevant topics in the field of health and fitness. I'm Mike Musiolo, human biomechanics specialist with Functional Patterns Santa Monica. Today, we're going to be talking about the most overrated exercise in the history of fitness, the squat. You may be thinking, Mike, why do you despise the squat so much? Is Functional Patterns just drinking the haterade? The answer is we don't hate the back squat as much as we think that its place at the top of the fitness hierarchy is massively unwarranted. Here's the thing about back squats. They've been a fitness staple since the dawn of fitness marketing. You can read about strong men from the early 1900s doing performative versions of this movement pattern, typically in the form of barbell back squats. In other words, the squat has been around, which is why we're going to show you why this is related to an important concept. If you followed functional patterns for a period of time, you may or may not have heard us talk about what's known as the cyclical fitness novelty machine. The cyclical fitness novelty machine is the process of recycling and repackaging worn out concepts and bringing them back into the forefront after having faded into the distance. You can think of it as a fitness fad. Take squats as a prime example. First, it's about heavy back squats 3 days a week. Then, no, back squats aren't functional. It's about front squats. Then, it's about squatting ATG or ass to grass. Or it's about squatting only to half depth to protect your back. Or it's about doing primal movements that involve deep flexion of the hips rather than quote unquote squatting. I could go on. It doesn't matter where you are in the fitness cycle, you're going to be hearing something about doing squats. And we get it, guys. Squats are easy to do, and they're easy to coach. Powerlifters and yoga deep squatters may tend to disagree, but unfortunately for them, we have the first principles in anthropology on our side. More on that in a moment. Besides the perpetual fitness novelty machine, don't forget that there are entire university curriculums written on the perception that back squats are a fundamental assessment and exercise without any indication that there could be negative externalities associated with it. So it stands to reason that although there is very little evidence to support the efficacy of prioritizing the squat, textbooks have a tendency to glorify this oversimplified way of approaching strength, conditioning, and rehab. Let's talk a little bit about anthropology. For those who may not know, anthropology is the study of what makes us human. You may remember in our previous back squat video, the study we cited that analyzed humans in sports and the biological tendency to walk, run, and throw. This emerging field of study is called human athletic paleobiology, in which scientists study how humans have evolved for modern sports that include these essential movement patterns. You may have also watched our video on how hard it is to come to a scientific consensus within the scientific community. Well, although that may be true, if there were any consensus in anthropology, it's leaning heavily, and I mean heavily, towards humans having evolved to walk, run, and throw. Aside from our previous study on human athletic paleobiology, we also have this study on the evolutionary basis of human running and its impact on neurogenesis, stating that running is an expression of our evolution and importantly tied to neural expression. In other words, how our brains are formed is tied to our evolutionary movement blueprint, as well as this study, which states that Homo sapiens are unique among primates in their capability for endurance running, further bolstering the hypothesis that many of our health problems come from ignoring our evolutionary adaptations, or this study juxtaposing our bipedal movements to that of chimps and explaining the many biomechanical differences, or this study explaining the important functions of the human glute max in running and how its evolution influenced our ability to run well, or this study talking about the evolution of the human hand for throwing, or this study showing how bipedalism actually provided an evolutionary advantage for hand-to-hand combat in competition amongst early hominids. Remember, you throw a punch. That's just the tip of the iceberg. Like I said, it's very difficult to come to an absolute concrete consensus in science. Some people don't even believe evolution is real. But for the evidence-based crowd, the consensus on the anthropological characteristics of humans is certainly more extensive than any studies supporting positive benefits of stretching or squatting. But people still do it, which is proof, once again, most people don't do things because the science says so. They do things because they've always been done that way, it's what everyone else is doing, or their particular differential advantage depends on it. But anyway, at Functional Patterns, we don't want to over-rely on paper studies anyway. So even if every single one of these studies were completely inconclusive, we preserve to observe nature in real time. So let's talk about the first principles. Take a look around you. When you walk down the street, and I try to say that as unironically as possible, do you see other people walking? Is walking not a primary movement pattern that you see other humans do? In sport, do many of them include running, throwing, or some variation thereof? It would seem as though they do. So, without citing any paper studies and just using our powers of observation, it would seem that although humans do move in a multitude of ways, walking and running are certainly in a top spot of the hierarchy in terms of what humans actually do most of the time. Now, what you don't see very often outside of the gym is humans bilaterally squatting. They certainly can squat. They should be able to squat. Squatting shouldn't hurt, but I would argue, strictly based on observing people in real time, that squatting is not in the top spot of fundamental function. We just don't see humans hopping around like kangaroos in order to do their daily errands. Now, I already know that some are thinking, what about getting up and down from a chair, or more crudely, a toilet seat? Here's how I'll encourage you to think about this. Imagine a person that walks with an appropriate level of gait speed and efficiency. Do you think that that person is going to have a hard time getting up and down off a chair or a toilet seat? The answer is no. If they have an efficient gait, squatting up and down from a chair is going to be a piece of cake. It should be silly to argue that you need to do heavy barbell back squats, as an example, in order to get up and down from a chair. Because when you train in respect to biology, movement patterns that aren't as high on the hierarchy of prioritization get better. A lot of people like to assume that running efficiency increases as you gain competency in the squat pattern. We'd like to argue that it's the opposite. As you gain efficiency in gait, you gain efficiency in the less fundamental squat. More on that later. First, I'd like to go a little deeper into why we're making this video. You see, we don't think squats are bad, really, even if they just aren't as fundamental as people think they are. What we think is bad is prioritizing the squat over gait. It's a key difference of premise there. In life, some things are just more important than others, and when you prioritize things that are less important in substitution of things that are more important, you pay for it, and in ways that can be pretty damaging. So, here's our argument, based on first principles and observations we have from working with people, as well as lots and lots and lots and lots of results. Prioritization of the bilateral squat causes imbalances in one's biomechanics because it doesn't account for the complexity of gait mechanics. So, as a unilaterally, contralaterally reciprocating creature, when you overemphasize bilateral squatting, you are not accounting for many fundamental aspects of your evolutionary biology. And so, when that happens, in most instances, prioritizing squats makes your gait cycle worse. And when your gait cycle becomes worse, pain is likely to follow. See our video on the movement elimination protocol for more info on why practicing movement patterns that disrespect gait typically cause major problems in people's overall progress in their movement competency and pain. It may not make it worse today or tomorrow, but over a long period of time, your neurology is learning how to become less efficient by prioritizing the squat. Even motions that are deceptively similar to a squat, such as a vertical jump, have frontal and transverse plane aspects that are tough to account for with a bilateral squat. And although, once again, it's super cool to see NBA players dunk or defend against a jump shot, the way they do it is significantly different from a barbell back squat, let's say, for example. And it's pretty clear that a lot of what they do, as well as in many other sports, is run. And we would also argue that increasing gait efficiency likely would improve their jumping mechanics as well anyway. So essentially, Anthony Davis's infamous injury rate is likely not a coincidence. If he reprioritized his training, he would likely injure himself less. Anyway, just another point or two because I really want to keep this video short. One thing we have to define is the idea of performance. That's one thing you'll hear trainers go on and on about over and over again. Back squats and/or squats in general are imperative for performance. Now, we get it. These guys are likely talking about sports performance. Okay, but then what do people usually do in sports? They run. So if coaches want to improve sports performance, shouldn't they be prioritizing gait? This is the problem with ambiguous terms and why functional patterns likes to take a first principles approach. The thing about squats, particularly back squats, but what we mean is the prioritization of squats in general, is there is absolutely no conclusive evidence that squats increase sprint speed. All studies are contradictory, non-conclusive, and don't utilize methods with large enough sample sizes or that account for enough variables. For my trust the science, evidence-based crowd, the science is just not there. For example, if something like heavy barbell squats were the cause of amazing sprint speed, then powerlifters should be able to enter any Olympic 100 meter and smoke the competition. That is definitely not what's happening. I'm not saying powerlifters can't sprint. I'm saying that there is no evidence to a true carryover to sprint performance, at least in the scientific literature. I'll show you what I mean. Let's take a look at a bit of the science. Let me first say that every study we found has glaring confounding variables that I'll list first, just so we cover our bases, and then I'll pick apart one study so you can see what I'm talking about in real time. Number one, no studies claiming the back squat increases sprint speed measure for a significant distance. All studies we've found are for 5 meters to 40 meters max, with very few actually testing for 40 meters. If the fastest sprinter in the world sprints the 100 meter, wouldn't it make sense to conduct at least a few studies at longer distances? Totally understand for rugby and football, shorter distances are applicable, of course, but most of these decreases in sprint time are marginal at best, with some essentially negligible. It's not hard to argue that the results would actually be worse at longer distances. This leads me to number two. No studies in back squat performance actually consistently display a significant increase in speed. The numbers are technically statistically significant, but most of the time they range between 1/10 and less than 1/10 of a second. Some people may argue that this matters at an elite level, but I would argue, one, what about everybody else in the world? And two, are the gains in speed worth the possible negative externalities, which there are likely many if we consider the first principles of evolutionary biology? Number three, in athletes who exhibit the highest 1-rep max squats as well as the highest sprint speeds, there is no way of knowing whether or not it's the fastest sprinters who have the highest 1-rep maxes or if it's the people with the highest 1-rep maxes who have the fastest sprints. In other words, if an athlete can already sprint well, then they may be more biomechanically disposed to have a higher 1-rep max. But is there biomechanical resiliency and efficiency due to squatting well or sprinting well? Which brings me to number four. Some studies on squats increasing sprint speed are done during pre-season training, which means that the squat programming was being done in conjunction with speed and agility training already. If that's the case, how do we know that it's the squats that are increasing sprint speed? Wouldn't their sprint speed increase with speed and agility training alone? Which brings me to number five. The vast majority of these studies are done on college-level athletes. You and I both know that the bulk of the people in the gym do not have the resiliency or capability of a college-level athlete physically. This also greatly limits the sample size and therefore statistical power. Which brings me to number six, because studies are expensive to conduct. Almost none of them are conducted for the long term. We don't know what happens to these people when they consistently do this programming for a long period of time, with constant progressive overload being the primarily manipulated variable, and what would happen in populations with special considerations, such as neurodegenerative disorders, older populations, or those with structural maladaptations, such as scoliosis, which in reality, almost everyone has in one way, shape, or form. But we could hypothesize with first principles thinking. Those are some of the big confounding variables, but I could go on. It all depends on the study, and honestly, you could send me any study on squatting and I could point out glaring confounding variables. The truth is that we haven't been able to find one convincing study on whether or not squatting increases performance. This includes the idea that squatting is good for injury prevention. The people that claim this are trying to prove it by claiming that absolute strength, in other words, 1 rep max squats, prevents injury, but haven't found a convincing way to define what absolute strength means, especially relative to humans. If you guys have studies you feel proves otherwise, let me know. But as I said in my previous video about peer-reviewed studies, randomized controlled trials, etc., this type of long-form formal science is expensive and very difficult to conduct, and especially in the fitness industry, they're not conducted in a way that's very helpful to practical application. I know many people seem to think otherwise, but if that were the case, then health metrics would be improving, and they are not. More people are needing hip and knee replacements than ever before, just as one example, which means we're not moving the needle in the right direction. Okay, so before I close out, let's take a look at one study briefly titled Relationship Between Maximal Squat Strength and 5, 10, and 40-yard Sprint Times. We'll link it below because I want to keep this video short so you guys can read it yourself. It's an often cited study, so it's pretty well known. So here's the primary issue with this study. 1, it's done on only 17 individuals, which is a fairly small sample size. 2, the sprint distances are short. Now I understand that they're football players, so they're using the 40, but considering the fastest man in the world sprints 100 meters, in our opinion, that should be the standard. No harm in testing even longer distances, such as 200 meters or 400 meters. 3, all individuals are highly trained Division I football players. The most impressive study would be able to take untrained individuals and improve their sprint speed. Although I do understand for this study, they were just trying to correlate 1 rep max squat with sprint speed. So I get that they needed individuals who already had experience doing a 1 rep max squat. 4, correlation does not equal causation. You would have to conduct several more experiments to determine whether the fastest individuals have the strongest squat, or if those with the strongest squats were the fastest individuals. So that's just a few points. I could certainly go on, and with other studies, you can look at the confounding variables I mentioned. Here's the deal. Ultimately, most articles talk about the squat like it's what people should be prioritizing. For example, this 2012 Men's Health article stating that the key to improving your sprinting speed isn't spending more time on the track, it's boosting your squat. No, it's likely quite the opposite. They go on to cite a study from the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research to sound authoritative and fancy, but that study doesn't prove anything conclusively whatsoever about sprint speed and squatting. That's just one of many, many, many examples of people trying to sound authoritative about barbell squatting and performance, when in reality, it's likely only those that are predisposed to be resilient and athletic biomechanically who are able to sustain this progressive overload. And as we've seen from the multiple injuries throughout sports recently, even they fall prey to training practices that do not respect the said principle. Perhaps we'll talk about that, those specific adaptations to imposed demands, in another video. In the meantime, I have to let you guys go. Remember, we don't hate the squat. We assert that the consumer deserves to know the most intellectually honest information. If you have studies that you feel prove otherwise, send them my way. I'm happy to take a look at them. But so far, I haven't found anything that's convincing enough to change my position. Also, make sure to read Tyranny of Words as you continue to join us in our series. If you have all this time to read the science, Tyranny of Words should be an easy read. This is Mike Musiolo from Functional Patterns Santa Monica, signing off, encouraging you to think intentionally and not habitually.